All right, welcome to our first Mammalogy video lecture. We're going to go over mammalian natural history, which is really mostly based on the fossil record. But we're going to start a little further back with the kingdom Animalia. So if you remember from your basic biology course, hopefully you went through some animal taxonomy. Animals first arose in the fossil record, previous to 600 million years ago. But they didn't fully radiate until what was called the Cambrian explosion, where you saw a lot of the modern phyla occurring in the fossil record. So the chordates then are the phylum in which the vertebrates and mammals exist. And the chordates first arose in the fossil record around 500 million years ago. So they were kind of the tail end of this Cambrian explosion. And you can see the Ediacaran biota are the beginning of the animals in the fossil record. So actually that first occurred near 700 million years ago. The Phylum Chordata, if you remember, has four derived characters: a notochord, which is a stiff supportive structure, and this a notochord occurs at some time in the development. For most extant mammals, the notochord is found early in development, much previous to being born. A dorsal hollow nerve cord. Okay. A pharyngeal gill slits, which go on to be different structures, just depending on the type of vertebrate, and a post-anal tail. The chordates then split into many different taxa. Most of them we associate with being fish, but some of them are lesser known, and most of them are marine as well. So we have lancelets and sea squirts and hagfish and lampreys. And then we get into some of the fish. The sharks and rays are lobe-finned and ray-finned fishes and lungfish. And eventually the ancestors of the lungfish transitioned into a terrestrial species, eventually having four legs on which they stood on land. And that then gave rise to the tetrapod clade. And then within the tetrapod clade, so most of them were tied still to water through reproduction, had to lay their eggs in some sort of moist environment. But then the development of the amniotic egg led to the radiation of amniotes. And the amniotic egg allows to make a still dependent on water, but that water environment could be left inside the egg, and so that egg could develop outside of water. And of course, mammals are one of the groups within Amniota. There are two lineages that then arose from the amniotes: the synapsids and the sauropsids. And within the sauropsids, we have two different skull arrangements: Anapsida and Diapsida. And when you look at the skulls of these three different groups, you can tell differences based on the temporal fenestra, or the hole behind the orbit. Anapsids, and meaning without, do not have a temporal fenestra. It is just bones behind their orbit. An example of that would be turtles. Synapsids have one temporal fenestra, one hole behind the orbit, and diapsids have two. and most reptiles then are diapsids. And a reptile-like ancestor is what synapsids then evolved from. And so those two fenestra eventually converged into one. So within the synapsids, we then have a diverse lineage with lots of taxa forming from them, including the therapsid reptiles and the cynodont reptiles. And these started to evolve many of the mammalian characteristics. Most of the synapsids went extinct, including most of the therapsids. But the cynodonts then are the ancestor which eventually gave rise to the mammals. So some skeletal changes, well, just for reference then, where we are. We have then within the Triassic and Permian the appearance of therapsids and cynodonts and the radiation of therapsids within Triassic. And finally, mammals come to the scene geologically in the fossil record in the Triassic as well. So some of the skeletal changes in cynodonts, some of these transitionary fossils, or include heterodont dentition. Heterodont means not all the teeth are the same. You have different types of teeth, and you can reference your own teeth. You have heterodont. You have incisors, canines, premolars, and molars. So we start to see canine teeth, modified incisors, things like that. They also had two occipital condyles. These are two projections in the back of the skull which articulate with the first vertebrae, the atlas. In reptiles, they have one, and so now we have the formation of two, and this allows for more neck movements. There's a secondary palate which formed. Okay, and then there are some locomotion characters which developed, including a deep acetabulum, and that is the part. The acetabulum is the socket in which the femur fits into, and the deeper it is, the more of the weight it can support. So rather than having sprawling legs to the outside, you then started to have legs which were more centralized underneath the body, the center of the body. And what that allowed the animals to do was be more upright, less sprawled, and thus eventually be able to run, have cursorial locomotion. You also had a reduction in the ribs in the lumbar vertebrae, as you can see in this one. There are no ribs down here, whereas this is a more primitive cynodont, and it still has ribs in these lumbar vertebrae, lower back vertebrae. And that is thought to have evolved with the structure called the diaphragm. So diaphragm is a muscle at the bottom of the ribs, which allows for expansion of the lungs in the body cavity. So a reduction then in these ribs allows for more flexibility in that part of the body. You also have a foot with a distinct calcanean heel. That allows for your Achilles tendon to form, again allowing for more running locomotion. Okay, so these mammals are now adapting in their ability to move, to breathe, to eat, and all of these things are connected, which we'll talk about later. They also have a reduction in jaw bones and the formation of the tympanic bulla, which is now a gathering chamber for sound. All right, so then you have all these changes eventually. So this down here, this is a modern-day mammal. And you can see no ribs on the lumbar vertebrae, legs or appendages that are underneath the body rather than sprawling. So here you have some sprawling here, some sprawling there, sprawling especially in the primitive. So this is the most primitive cynodont, and then it goes in this direction till we get to this one. Okay. Finally, Mammaliformes arose in the fossil record, and this is a monophyletic clade which includes all of the extinct and living or extant mammals. It's most easily and characteristically defined by the joint between the jaw and the skull. In mammals, you have a dentary squamosal joint. In non-mammals and reptiles, you have the quadrate articular joint. So therapsids and cynodonts have the quadrate and articular joint. Mammaliformes, then you see this mammalian joint. You do have some transitionary cynodonts where we see actually both joints, the mammalian jaw joint and the reptilian jaw joint. But it appears that the reptilian jaw joint in these transitionary fossils had a reduction in these bones, quadrate and stapes, which were used for hearing, and the actual movement of the jawbone itself focused more on the dentary squamosal joint. So we can see this in the fossil record, but we also see this in ontogeny. So ontogeny is the development of an organism. Vertebrates have, a very complex and drawn out ontogeny, and you can take snapshots by looking at, embryonic and fetal bones, and when you look at the bones and the development of them, you can see the changes that take place. So ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny was first a phrase coined by Ernst Haeckel, where he noticed that the fossil record looked very similar to the transitionary bones in a developing, fetus or fetus. So this is actually not from a fossil record. This is from a possum fetus. When you look at the skull bones or the jaw bones in different time periods, you see it starts out with multiple jaw bones, similar to a reptilian jaw, and the connection to the skull as well. But over time, those start to reduce, and eventually those bones, which were part of the jaw, become part of the inner ear, and are then now shifting from jaw use, from moving the jaw or anchoring the jaw, to now being part of the picking up vibrations for sound. Okay, when you look at the fossil record, it shows a similar pattern. You have these primitive or older fossils which have multiple jaw bones. You have the transitionary ones where the craniomandibular joint shows a reduction in the jaw bones and an increase in these bones to be used in hearing, and eventually transitioning all the way into the ear and no longer connecting to the jaw, and now you have the squamosal dentary point for your craniomandibular joint. So that's an example of ontogeny recapitulating phylogeny. So along with this, you had a lot of metabolic and dietary shifts, which kind of happened all around at the same time. So one is the development of the masseter muscle, which is a muscle that connects to this structure called the zygomatic arch And the masseter muscle then allowed for more movements on the jaw, including side-to-side jaw movements, which is important for herbivorous species that kind of chew by crushing their vegetation from side to side. It also had an increased bite force and a more localized bite force to the front of the mouth, or it can also be in the back of the mouth, depending on the species. And it reduced the stress of the jaw, reduced stress in the biting action. You also have, again, formation of the secondary palate, which we mentioned before, which allows the separation of breathing and eating, so you can chew while breathing. Allows for more efficient eating. And the development of the diaphragm, which we mentioned before. The diaphragm, here's a picture here, is a muscle that extends below the lungs and the thoracic cavity. It separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity. And by flexing and relaxing this muscle, you cause air to come into the lungs. It also is coordinated with movements, so that allows for more efficient breathing while exercising. So that allowed for more movement of the animals, of the mammals with this. They also, at some point, and this it's hard to determine when, developed endothermy, or internal heat regulation through metabolic processes. Heterodentition, and there is a diversity in modern day mammals of different types of teeth which coordinate with a specific dietary needs, or whatever that group or taxa is eating. And double-rooted cheek teeth, so molars with multiple roots, which then are anchored into the dentary bone. And these also have varying shapes depending on whether they are carnivores or herbivores. But that anchoring allowed for a diversity of shapes to form, and a diversity of types of food that could be eaten. So early mammals then were mostly small, probably 20 to 30 grams, and largely because the large animals at this point were mostly dinosaurs, and so those niches were filled, and anything really large was probably a prey item of these dinosaurs. But these smaller mammals could then fill smaller niches and probably escape predators based on their small size. They also had large brains per body size, which allowed them to be, more intelligent. They were mostly nocturnal, so fulfilling niches which were otherwise diurnal in dinosaurs. They probably had mammary glands and deciduous teeth, but we don't know. These don't fossilize as well or at all. And it's still unknown whether they gave live birth or laid eggs. I personally think they probably laid eggs, since we have monotremes, which are extant today, which lay eggs, and they are mammals. So it seems like that would be the ancestral trait. But probably live birth developed early after the development of mammals. So after kind of living in the shadow of the dinosaurs in the Triassic and Jurassic, in the late Jurassic and throughout the Cretaceous, you had the evolution of many different groups, and this widens as we see more species in the fossil record. and including the 3 extant or living groups, which we have in the mammals, the Metatherians, Eutherians, and Monotremes. These all evolved during the Cretaceous time period. But many of them, although they were very diverse for a moment in geological history, many of them also went extinct within that same time period. However, when you look at the skeletons of these Jurassic and Cretaceous mammals, which went extinct, many of them have similar body structures and body plans, and probably had similar niches to modern day mammals, including we've got a flying squirrel type, some fossorial, meaning dug around in the dirt, or semi-fossorial. Tree-loving species, even some semi-aquatic species as well, similar to our otter and beaver. And so they were quite diverse, but many of them went extinct before the radiation of modern mammals. And again, they had many changes in dentition, resulting in these dietary specializations. The modern mammals then started to diversify within the Cretaceous time period. And what was happening during this time is you had originally a landmass where everything was generally connected, and so there was not allowed for interbreeding species or everything to evolve in a sort of connected, similar biogeography. But as this started to break up during the Cretaceous period, now you had isolated geography, which allowed, and they started to be further and further apart, which allowed for different selection pressures and thus different evolution and radiation of species. So placental or Eutherian and Metatherian mammals then diversified greatly as the continents broke up and as the dinosaurs went extinct. So as they went extinct, they opened up many of these larger niches. And we also saw the diversification of new food sources through angiosperms, or flowering plants, which, flowers and fruits and seeds and the insects that fed on them became new prey sources. And all of this led to new niches, which could then be filled by irradiation of mammals. So most orders, extant orders, appeared during the late Cretaceous and early Paleocene time periods. And so that brings us up to the Eocene here, Paleocene, where we see our the appearance of our modern orders. And we're going to essentially, we'll stop right there for our natural history, because we're going to go through these different families and subfamilies and genera individually, or these orders, later in the class. But that then is the natural history, or summary of the natural history of mammals.